Theo Bridges was 40 years old. When his wife handed him divorce papers on the same Tuesday, his company's largest outstanding invoice was formalized as a default in Mecklenburg County Court. And he said nothing. Because he had learned by then that silence was a form of preparation. He drove a work van with the old company logo fading on the side door. He wore a canvas jacket to site meetings and birthday dinners and everything in between. His wife's friends had been telling her quietly for 2 years that she could do better, and she had always defended him. Until the Thursday she stopped. What Rochelle had told her attorney was that her husband's business was failing, that the marriage had run its course, and that a consultant she trusted had advised her the window to file was closing. What the consultant's name was, Marcus Webb. What Marcus Webb had been given during a paid engagement with Bridges Construction LLC 8 months before the filing was access to the company's internal financial projections, its receivables schedule, and its restructuring timeline. What he had shared with Rochelle in 23 private communications documented in Theo's company email archive was the specific date on which the company's distress would be most visible in the public record. What Rochelle had never once asked, through 8 years of marriage, was what Theo kept in the locked drawer of his home office desk, or why the second company his mother had always told him to build had a formation date that was 14 months before she filed. 6 months after she handed him those papers, Rochelle sat across a conference table from him and could not stop the tears from coming. They were not the kind that asked for anything. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The home office was the first room Theo had finished in the house, and it was where he did his best work before the city started. He was there at 5:30 most mornings, coffee on the left side of the desk, the project files open in front of him, the notebook in the drawer he had not opened yet. The desk was solid oak, built by a craftsman in Suffolk whom Theo had met on a job site and had hired for this piece specifically, giving the man his own design requirements and leaving the execution entirely to him. He had refinished the top surface himself when a water ring appeared in the second year, working the grain with a hand sander on a Saturday afternoon until it was right. He maintained things the way his mother had taught him, with attention, without waiting for the problem to become a larger problem. His mother, Loretta Bridges, had been a paralegal at a Norfolk law firm for 27 years, raising Theo alone after his father left when Theo was 6. She had died 8 months ago, at 64, of a stroke that arrived without warning on a Wednesday morning, and the grief of it had settled into Theo with the weight of something that did not lift but that, over time, changed shape. She had been the first person he told about every significant decision he had ever made, and the absence of her was most specific in the moments before he made a new one. She used to tell him, "Theo, don't mistake a hard season for a permanent address." She had said it first when he was 19 and his first job had ended badly, and he had carried it into every subsequent difficulty, with the understanding that she had been right every single time. Bridges Capital Group LLC had been incorporated 14 months ago. It held 3 commercial properties, 2 development sites, and a partnership interest in a mixed-use project on the Norfolk waterfront. All of it assembled during the same period that Bridges Construction LLC had been going through the receivables crisis that would eventually bring the original company to a managed dissolution. The 2 companies had always been separate entities, separate accounts, separate counsel. Bridges Capital had been funded through Theo's personal investment reserves, saved methodically across 12 years of professional income, held in accounts that predated the marriage and had never been commingled with marital funds. He had incorporated it on a Thursday in January, 11 months before the receivables crisis became visible in the public record, because his mother had always told him that the second company was the real one, and he had listened. Rochelle knew he was a developer. She had never asked which companies he held. He had met Rochelle Carson at a Virginia Beach community planning meeting 9 years ago. She was presenting a nonprofit proposal for affordable housing development. He was reviewing the contractor specifications for a similar project, and they had ended up in the same small group discussion and had disagreed productively for 45 minutes. He had liked her directness. He had liked that she was building something and took it seriously. He had asked her to have dinner, and she had said yes without deliberating, which told him something useful about how she made decisions. They married 2 years later. The marriage had been collaborative and close in the first years, and Rochelle had been genuinely interested in his work, had attended site walks, had understood the financial structures intuitively, had been the kind of partner who made the work better because she engaged with it honestly. Then the interest had narrowed, and the engagement had become more intermittent, and the collaborative quality had shifted into something more parallel and less connected. The way two people can share a life without fully sharing a view of what they're each doing in it. His mother died in January. The receivables crisis at Bridges Construction began in February. Rochelle filed in March. He had been carrying 2 of those 3 things for the month before the third arrived, and when the papers came, he set them on his desk next to his mother's notebook and sat with all of it in the quiet of a man who was not surprised by much and was not going to be destroyed by any of it. He did not sleep well for 4 days. He did not stop working for a single one of them. He went to the Norfolk waterfront site every morning, reviewed contractor submissions, answered calls from the Capital Group's lending partners, and returned home each evening to a house that was half empty in the way that houses became half empty when the person who had lived in them with intent had left. He ate at his desk. He kept his mother's notebook closed. He did not open it because he was not ready yet to look at her handwriting in a room that had too much silence in it. On the 5th day, he called Patricia. On the 6th, he opened the email archive. The following morning, Theo opened his company email archive and began reading from 14 months prior. He had not done this before the filing, had not had cause to, had trusted the engagement with Marcus Webb as a professional consultation, and moved past it when the engagement ended. He was reading it now because Patricia had flagged the asset discovery request that Rochelle's attorney had sent, and 2 of the account numbers listed in the request were not publicly registered. They were internal account references from a company financial model that had been shared with Webb during the consultation period. Someone had given Rochelle's attorney information they could not have found in any public filing. He read for 4 hours. 23 emails between Marcus Webb's personal address and Rochelle's personal address, all sent during the 6-week period of the consultation engagement, none of them business-related in content. The subject lines were generic: scheduling, catch up, thinking of you. But the content, when he read it fully, described the company's situation with a specificity that could only have come from the financial models Webb had been given. In one exchange, Webb described the receivables schedule in enough detail to identify the specific Tuesday when the default would become a matter of public court record. In another, he wrote, "The window is narrowing. You should talk to someone this week." Rochelle had seen her attorney for the first time the following Monday. He moved with the same deliberate calm that had defined every decision he had made since the January morning he stood in front of a hospital window in Norfolk and understood that the season had changed permanently. He exported the 23 emails in a single archive. He screenshotted the timestamps and cross-referenced them against Webb's consultant agreement, which included a non-disclosure clause covering all proprietary financial information shared during the engagement. He printed the relevant section of the contract. He matched each email to the clause it violated. He built a timeline: 14 months of quiet building, 6 weeks of deliberate coordination. one Tuesday a formalized betrayal. He watched the company go under and read the default notice, and received the divorce papers and sat through the grief. And all through it he had been building the new entity, patiently, in separate accounts, and separate filings, and separate conversations that Rochelle had never been part of, because she had never asked. And now the full shape of that was visible to him in a way it had not been before. He photographed his mother's notebook. He put it back in the drawer. Then he called Patricia and told her what he had found. Patricia had reviewed every page of the email archive by the following afternoon and called Theo from her office with the measured precision she brought to things that were going to require effort. He shared proprietary financial modeling data with your wife during a paid engagement covered by a confidentiality clause, she said. That's a civil breach with documented damages. We can tie the timing of the filing directly to information he disclosed without authorization. Is it enough to affect the divorce? Virginia allows the court to consider economic bad faith in equitable distribution. If we can demonstrate that the filing was timed using insider information obtained in breach of contract, we can argue that your wife's position was built on misconduct. She paused. We can also file the civil complaint against Webb independently. That filing becomes part of the public record. It puts everything on paper. She was quiet for a moment. There is one more thing. The discovery request your wife's attorney submitted lists accounts by internal reference numbers that were never in any public filing. The only way they could have those numbers is through Webb, which also means that everything they know about Bridges Capital Group is what Webb told them, and Webb's information appears to be incomplete. How incomplete? Significantly, Patricia said. He described the entity by partial name and estimated its holdings at a fraction of what the registered filings show. He did not have the full picture. She said it calmly and without drama. They have been preparing for a settlement against a company that is smaller than the one that actually exists. He drove to Norfolk the following Saturday morning and stopped at a house in Gent, a brick colonial on a quiet street where his uncle Wallace Bridges had lived for 30 years. Wallace was 65, retired from 20 years in commercial banking, a man who had reviewed more development financing packages than most people had ever seen, and who understood, precisely and completely, how Theo's financial structure worked. They sat at the kitchen table. Wallace made coffee without asking. He set a cup in front of Theo and listened to everything without commenting. His face carried the particular stillness of a retired banker who had spent 40 years reading between the lines of financial documents and had learned that the space between the lines was where the real story always lived. When Theo finished, Wallace was quiet for a long moment. She filed at the lowest visible point, Wallace said. The Tuesday the default hit the record, and she has no idea about the Capital Group. No. Wallace turned his coffee mug in both hands. Her consultant told her the window was closing. He was looking at the old company and calling that the whole picture. He set the mug down. He missed 14 months of work because he didn't know where to look. He looked at Theo directly. Your mother used to say you were most deliberate when you were most quiet. She'd say you did your best building when nobody was watching. He paused. I believe she was right about that. The only reason to build in silence, he said, was so the building could speak for itself. By Thursday of the following week, Patricia had filed the civil complaint against Marcus Webb for breach of the consultant confidentiality agreement. The filing was public record. Webb's professional liability insurer had been notified. 2 other former clients who had heard about the filing had reached out to Patricia's office with their own questions about Webb's conduct during prior engagements. The background review on Webb confirmed what the email archive had suggested. He was 43, a licensed real estate consultant who had never built a firm of his own. whose income was primarily derived from short-term project engagements, who drove a leased E-Class and presented the surface of a career that had more width than depth. His last 2 engagements before the bridge's construction work had ended in disputes. One had gone to arbitration and settled for an undisclosed amount. He had moved offices twice in 3 years, each time to a smaller space in a less visible location, the specific trajectory of a practice running below the level it advertised. He had positioned himself to Rochelle as someone who understood the development market comprehensively. He had given her a number and a date, and a level of certainty that his track record did not support, and she had trusted it the way people trusted experts they wanted to believe, which was to say, without asking for the credentials behind the confidence. Patricia also documented the marital waste component, $11,800 in joint account withdrawals by Rochelle during the 60 days before the filing, a pattern that followed the advice timeline Webb's emails described precisely. Theo drove to the Norfolk waterfront development site that Friday evening. He stood at the edge of the lot where the first phase of the mixed-use project was being framed. 18 stories, retail on the ground floor, residential above, the largest project Bridges Capital Group had undertaken. He had been on this site twice a week for 4 months. He had reviewed every contractor submission personally. He had walked the foundation with the structural engineer and understood what was under the ground as well as he understood what was rising from it. The steel was going up frame by frame, and the city was beginning to appear in the gaps between what he was building. He stood there for a long time, without moving, and he thought about his mother and the notebook in his desk drawer, and the addresses she had written down with a careful hand across 20 years of wanting, and he thought about Rochelle filing on the Tuesday the default hit the record, and he thought about how she had never once walked a site with him in the last 2 years of the marriage, had never once asked what the second company was doing, had never once looked at the construction schedule the way she had looked at things when she was still interested in what he was building. She had stopped looking before the build began. She had no idea this was here. He went home. He made dinner. He ate alone for the 3rd month in a row and found that solitude had its own quality that was not the same as loneliness, and that he had begun to understand the difference. The work was the answer. It had always been the answer. The law firm's conference room was on the 14th floor of a glass tower in downtown Norfolk, and on the Tuesday morning of the settlement conference, it had the particular loaded quiet of a room where consequential things were about to be said for the record. Rochelle arrived with her attorney, a man named Carver who had been thorough and organized and had built his case on the financial picture that Marcus Webb's information had shaped. She was composed, dressed for a conclusion, the way she had always dressed for things she expected to control. She sat across the table from Theo and arranged her notes with the efficiency of someone managing a final formality. Theo was already seated with Patricia beside him. He had his project files on the table. His mother's notebook was in his inside jacket pocket, where he had placed it that morning for reasons he had not fully articulated to himself. Patricia opened. She placed the Bridges Capital Group portfolio summary on the table, a document she had prepared with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything, and began to read the asset list into the record. A commercial building in Norfolk, acquired during the Bridges construction restructuring for $440,000, currently appraised at $1.2 million. A residential development site in Chesapeake, under construction, projected completion value of $2.4 million. A partnership interest in the waterfront, mixed-use development, current equity position $890,000. 3 additional commercial properties across the Virginia Beach and Norfolk markets. Combined portfolio equity $4.7 million. Incorporated 14 months prior to the filing. funded entirely through personal capital reserves predating the marriage, held in separate accounts with no marital commingling. Not a marital asset. Carver had been writing. He had stopped writing. Rochelle was looking at the portfolio summary. Her attorney had estimated the total marital estate at approximately $800,000. She had filed believing she was leaving a man whose best years of building were behind him. Webb had told her the picture was clear. Webb had told her the timing was right. Webb had looked at a single entity in distress and concluded that was everything. And she had trusted that conclusion over 8 years of evidence to the contrary. Patricia continued. The civil complaint against Marcus Webb, breach of confidentiality, documented damages, filed and public. The marital waste documentation, $11,800, dated, recoverable. The email archive cross-reference showing the filing had been deliberately timed using insider information obtained in breach of contract. Carver said, "We'll need a recess too. We'd prefer to continue," Theo said. His voice was even and not unkind. "There's a schedule to keep." Rochelle looked at him. Something in her expression had begun to move, and once it began it did not stop, the way large understandings arrived when there was no longer any structure to hold them back. She had handed him papers on a Tuesday in March, at the lowest visible point of his career. 8 weeks after his mother had died, in a window her advisor had identified as maximum leverage. She had been advised by a man who had seen a partial picture and called it the whole thing, and she had believed him, and she had been wrong in a way that was now being documented, item by item, into the official record of their marriage. The tears came without theater. They came the way grief came in the absence of hope, quietly, with full understanding. And without anyone to ask anything of, Carver asked again for a recess. Theo looked at the portfolio list in front of him. The projects had names: the Loretta Street Development, the Haverford Commercial Building, the address on the Norfolk Street where his mother had once pointed to a storefront and said she had always wanted to own something like that. The Granby Avenue site, another address from the notebook, a block she had walked past every day on her way to work for 20 years. Names from a notebook in his inside jacket pocket, written in his mother's careful hand across 20 years of wanting, when she had been saving toward addresses she never reached. He had reached them for her. He had watched the company fail and received the papers at his lowest and buried his mother in January and built something new through all of it, in silence, the way she had always told him the real building happened. "Let's finish," he said. He did not look at Rochelle again. 7 months later, Theo was standing on the front steps of the waterfront mixed-use development on the morning of its dedication ceremony. The building was complete. 18 floors of it, gleaming and solid, and exactly what he had drawn in the project plans 14 months before anyone else had seen the site. The ground floor ribbon had a brass placard to the left of the entrance, the Loretta Building, developed by Bridges Capital Group, dedicated to Loretta Bridges, 1959-2023, who built everything with what she had and left the rest to those she raised. He had written those words himself, and had not shown them to anyone before they were cast. The divorce had been finalized 10 weeks prior. The asset structure had held without challenge. The marital waste recovery order had been entered. The Bridges Capital Group portfolio was now under Patricia's care as Theo expanded into 2 additional Virginia Beach properties, acquisitions that reflected the company's new standing in the regional development market. A standing built entirely in the 14 months when everyone who had known about Bridges construction assumed there was nothing left to build. Webb's civil case was progressing. His insurer had settled the core breach of contract claim, and a separate licensing review was ongoing. His consulting practice had contracted to a fraction of its prior scale. He had relocated to Richmond. Rochelle had accepted a position at a smaller nonprofit in the Tidewater area, a lateral move made more complicated by the circumstances that had become. In Virginia Beach's professional community, a known story. Her mother had called Theo once, 3 months after the settlement, to say she was sorry for the timing and the manner of it. He had thanked her and told her he appreciated the call, and had meant both things. There was a woman named Celeste in his life now, a historic preservation architect who had come into the Chesapeake site on a historic compliance review and had proceeded to ask the most specific and useful questions about the building's original structure that any consultant had ever asked him. She had a straightforward manner and a quality of attention that did not perform for anyone, and that he found, over the months of working alongside her, to be the kind of thing he had forgotten to look for in a person. They had dinner for the first time on a Tuesday evening in February. She had brought nothing with her except herself, and a willingness to say what she actually thought, and he had considered that sufficient. Standing on the steps of the Loretta Building in the late spring morning, Theo watched the small crowd of tenants and contractors and colleagues who had gathered for the ribbon cutting, and he thought about his mother's notebook and the addresses in it, and the long distance between wanting something and building it, and the specific way that distance collapsed when you refused to mistake a hard season for a permanent address. He had known that his whole life. He had simply needed the season to make it fully true. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.